It was the break of dawn when the scream shattered the calm silence of the sheriff's ranch. Sheriff Thomas Harding, a man of rugged features and steely eyes, had been up late, going over reports from his deputies. When the sound of his daughter's cry pierced the air, his heart stopped for a moment, then raced in panic. He sprinted from his office to the main house, but by the time he reached the porch, the scene before him had already unraveled into chaos. The girl, his only daughter, Sarah, had been taken by outlaws. Sarah! Thomas shouted, running toward the barn where her bedroom window was open. He could still see the trail of dust from the horses galloping off in the distance. A small group of rustlers had raided the sheriff's property before, but none of them had dared to cross the line like this. Kidnapping a sheriff's daughter was a blatant act of war, and Thomas knew this was more than a robbery. This was personal. His mind raced as he desperately searched for any signs of the kidnappers. Sarah had always been the apple of his eye, strong-willed, sharp-minded, and fiercely independent. In many ways, she was more like him than his late wife ever had been. They'd spent countless hours together on the ranch, sharing stories of the Old West, both its triumphs and its darkest moments. But now, she was gone. The town had quickly rallied after hearing the news. Deputies combed the nearby forests, while townsfolk organized a search party. But Thomas knew deep down that the clock was ticking, and the longer his daughter was in the outlaws' hands, the less chance he had to bring her back alive. That was when the idea hit him. The only person who could track down these outlaws with any hope of success was someone who knew the land better than anyone, a man who was part of the wilderness, a man who had the skills to move unnoticed, a man who walked the borderlands like a shadow. His name was Red Hawk, and he was an Apache tracker. The man was a legend. Some called him a ghost for his ability to move through the desert and forests without leaving a trace. Others spoke of his nearly supernatural understanding of the land, the sky, and the creatures that roamed it. He had earned a reputation among both settlers and native tribes, but his loyalties were complicated. While the sheriff had tried to recruit him before, Red Hawk had always refused, preferring to remain apart from the conflicts that raged between the settlers and the indigenous peoples. But this time, it was different. Sarah Harding was no ordinary settler's daughter, and Red Hawk was not a man to stand by when an innocent life was at stake. At the edge of town, in a small adobe hut near the river, Red Hawk sat quietly, cleaning his bow and sharpening his knives. His keen eyes noticed the sheriff approaching long before the man stepped into view. The sheriff was a formidable figure, but Red Hawk knew that this wasn't a visit for pleasantries. "You've come for me, haven't you?" Red Hawk's voice was calm, but firm. "Red Hawk," Sheriff Harding said, his voice tinged with urgency, "I need your help. I know why you're here." "Thomas Harding," Red Hawk replied, eyes never leaving the blade in his hand. "Your daughter was taken." The sheriff felt a pang in his chest, but he quickly pushed it down. "They're outlaws, a gang. I know this land better than anyone, but I'm not the one who can track them down. You're the only one who can." Red Hawk paused, his expression unreadable. The air between them thickened with a tension that spoke of old grievances, past wounds, and the unspoken barriers between their peoples. "I've told you before," Red Hawk said, his voice low, "I'm not your tracker." The sheriff's face hardened. "This isn't about us or our history. It's about Sarah, a young girl, my daughter." For a moment, Red Hawk didn't respond. He studied the sheriff closely, gauging the man's sincerity. Then, without a word, he stood up and strapped on his gear. His movements were deliberate, purposeful. "I'll track them," Red Hawk said. "But it will cost you." The sheriff hesitated, but then nodded. "Name your price." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Red Hawk's mouth. "When I return her, we'll talk." With that, Red Hawk turned and began to move, his silent footsteps already melding into the land as if he had never left it. Red Hawk's feet moved silently across the earth, his senses heightened as he followed the faint tracks left behind by the outlaws. The sun was still low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast plains, but he had already covered miles. To an outsider, the land might have seemed barren, but to Red Hawk, it was alive. Every rock, every tree, every whisper of wind held a clue. The sheriff had given him little information about the outlaws, beyond their gang size and the direction they had headed, but Red Hawk didn't need details. He only needed the land, and the land spoke to him in ways no one else could understand. As he moved deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of the world quieted, and the shadows stretched long and wide. He knew the dangers of the land all too well. The treacherous rivers, the hidden ravines, and the predators that roamed freely, both human and beast. The outlaws were dangerous, but Red Hawk was more dangerous still. He had been a tracker since he was a boy, raised by his grandfather in the highlands, learning the ways of the Apache people. His people had once roamed these lands freely, hunting and living with the earth, but those days were long gone. Now, the land was a battleground between settlers, lawmen, and the Apache. Yet, there were still those who respected the old ways, and Red Hawk was one of them. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher. Red Hawk paused at a waterhole to drink, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The outlaws had made camp here the night before, judging by the faint trail of ashes from their fire. He knelt by the ashes, his fingers brushing the cold remnants. The air around him grew still, and he closed his eyes for a moment, reaching out with his senses. He could almost feel the presence of the gang, loud, crude, and careless in their haste. They had rushed through here, not taking the time to cover their tracks, perhaps because they thought no one could follow them. But Red Hawk was no ordinary man. He could hear their voices in the wind, feel their unease in the ground beneath him. They were heading toward the mountains. The outlaws, in their haste to escape, had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the terrain. Red Hawk knew these mountains well. The high cliffs, the narrow passes, and the deep ravines could be treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the land. But to Red Hawk, it was home. He stood, his bow slung over his shoulder, his knife tucked into his belt, and set off in pursuit. As the day wore on, the landscape shifted. The dry plains gave way to dense, rocky terrain, and the trees grew thicker. Red Hawk's senses remained sharp, his every step measured and deliberate. Hours later, as the sun began to set, he spotted signs of the outlaws again: broken branches, a boot print in the dirt, and the occasional discarded item. A scarf, a gun belt. These were signs of carelessness, the kind of mistakes that came from overconfidence. They had been making their way toward a mountain pass that led into a narrow gorge, a place where a small group of men could hide and easily defend themselves. Red Hawk's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. The outlaws were likely aware of the advantages this terrain offered. But Red Hawk also knew that such a location would be a double-edged sword. While it could give them temporary safety, it would also limit their movement. They would be trapped if he could find a way to force them into the open. Nightfall came quickly in the mountains, and with it, the temperature dropped. Red Hawk found a sheltered spot beneath a rock overhang, where he could rest and plan his next move. The night was still, but his mind remained sharp. The more he thought about the sheriff's daughter, the more he understood the urgency. She was not just another victim to be rescued, she was a symbol. Her safety meant something larger, something that would have lasting effects on both settlers and native peoples. He wasn't sure what the sheriff's motivations were beyond his love for his daughter, but he couldn't afford to let personal grievances cloud his focus. As the night grew darker, Red Hawk's thoughts turned to strategy. He needed to be swift, precise, and, above all, silent. The element of surprise would be his greatest weapon. The outlaws, no doubt, were expecting a chase, but they weren't prepared for the relentless pursuit of a man who knew these mountains better than anyone. With the first light of dawn, Red Hawk rose to his feet. The time for rest was over. His eyes narrowed as he prepared himself for the final leg of the journey. He was getting closer. The morning air was crisp and carried with it the scent of pine and earth. Red Hawk moved with silent precision through the rocky terrain, his every step calculated, as though he were one with the land itself. The outlaws were only a few miles ahead now, their trail clear in the dirt and stone. The sun was still low, casting long shadows on the mountainside, but the warmth would soon follow. The outlaws, ignorant of the tracker on their heels, would likely believe they had time to rest, to regroup. Red Hawk could already see their camp in his mind's eye, crude, disorganized, a group of men who underestimated their pursuer and overestimated the security of their position. It was a mistake that would cost them dearly. He slowed his pace as he neared the narrow gorge they were hiding in. The cliffs on either side grew steeper, and the only way through was a tight pass barely wide enough for a wagon. The ground was littered with loose rocks, and the sound of rushing water echoed in the distance from a stream that carved its way through the valley floor. Red Hawk crouched low, his eyes scanning the area. He could see the smoke of their campfire rising in the air, hear the faint sound of laughter, loud, boisterous. The men were far too relaxed for the danger they were in. They thought they had escaped. They thought they were safe. But Red Hawk knew better. He pulled his bow from his back and nocked an arrow. The string hummed softly as he drew it back, but he held his fire. The moment wasn't right. He wasn't here to kill them all. Not yet. Instead, he wanted to draw them out. To get them moving, to break the complacency that had settled into their bones. With a steady breath, Red Hawk moved silently along the ridgeline above the gorge. Looking for the best vantage point. From his position, he could see the camp clearly. 2 men were sitting by the fire, warming their hands, while another paced back and forth, clearly on lookout. At least 3 more were holed up further back, no doubt keeping an eye on the horses, which were tethered to nearby trees. But there was no sign of Sir, at least, not yet. Red Hawk's eyes narrowed as he studied the outlaws' positions. They were scattered, vulnerable. If he could take out the sentries first, the others would be easy to pick off one by one. His focus shifted briefly to the sound of hooves echoing in the distance. A single rider was coming. The bandits had no idea that Red Hawk had already closed in on them, and they were too distracted to notice the approaching rider. The sound of the hooves grew louder, and for a moment, Red Hawk's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the sheriff? No. He dismissed the thought immediately. Thomas Harding wouldn't have been foolish enough to come in pursuit. He trusted Red Hawk. And the sheriff knew better than to risk his own neck in a situation that demanded subtlety and patience. The rider came into view. It was a woman. Red Hawk's pulse quickened as he recognized the silhouette. It was Sarah Harding, the sheriff's daughter. Her hands were bound behind her, her face pale with exhaustion. She was riding on one of the outlaws' horses, looking nothing like the strong-willed young woman Red Hawk had imagined. Her clothes were torn, and the desperation in her eyes mirrored the fear in his own heart. The outlaws hadn't just kidnapped her, they had been treating her like property. A mere bargaining chip in their games. The sight of her brought something cold and sharp to Red Hawk's gut. His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were good. Now, he had no choice but to act. As the outlaws led Sarah toward the camp, Red Hawk took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the smooth wood of his bow. His first target was the man who had been pacing the lookout. With a single motion, the arrow flew from the bowstring, and the man dropped like a stone, silent as a shadow. The others didn't even hear the whisper of the arrow's passage. The remaining outlaws, startled by the suddenness of the attack, scrambled to draw their weapons. It was too late. Red Hawk had already slipped down the slope, positioning himself above the camp. Another arrow flew, this time striking a second outlaw in the shoulder. The man cried out, falling to the ground, his rifle clattering against the rocks. Panic spread through the camp like wildfire. The outlaws scrambled, looking for cover, but Red Hawk was already upon them. He moved like a specter, an embodiment of the land itself, silent, quick, and deadly. Another outlaw fell, this time by a well-placed strike from his hunting knife. But it was the sound of Sarah's voice, weak but sharp, that broke through the chaos. "Stop," she cried out, her voice trembling. "Don't hurt them, please." Red Hawk froze mid-step, his knife raised in the air. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there, flicker of recognition, of trust. "Red Hawk, don't," she pleaded again, her voice strained. "They'll kill me if you," the leader of the outlaws, the man who had been sitting by the fire, took the opportunity to draw his gun, aiming it directly at Sarah's head. "I don't think you're in a position to be making demands, Apache," he growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Red Hawk's eyes narrowed, and his heart pounded in his chest. One wrong move, and the girl would be dead. But he was not a man who panicked. He was a man of control, of precision. With a swift motion, he threw his knife. The blade spun through the air, embedding itself in the outlaw's hand, forcing him to drop the weapon. The tension was thick in the air. The remaining outlaws stared at Red Hawk, realizing they were no longer in control. "Let her go," Red Hawk said, his voice cold, steady. The tension in the gorge was palpable, each outlaw frozen, caught between the power of their leader and the silent threat of the Apache tracker. Red Hawk's eyes never left the man in front of him, the leader, whose bloodied hand was still wrapped tightly around the knife lodged in his palm. His men were a few paces behind, looking shaken and uncertain. Sarah stood a short distance away, bound and pale, her gaze flicking nervously between Red Hawk and her captors. She wasn't sure what to make of this moment. Fear and relief danced across her expression. But one thing was certain. She didn't want any more bloodshed. The leader's lips twisted into a sneer, his voice hoarse but still full of defiance. "You think you can just come in here and take You're not in control here, Apache. Red Hawk's stance was unwavering. Let her go, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The leader scoffed. You really think you're in charge? You'll kill me, and the others will hunt you down. You can't hide from men like us. Red Hawk didn't flinch. He'd heard this kind of bravado before, men thinking they could intimidate with words. But Red Hawk wasn't a man who was swayed by threats. He studied the outlaws rough, loud, and weak in comparison to the land he knew so well. They were no match for him. Sarah's voice broke through the thick silence, her words strained. Please, don't. Red Hawk turned to look at her, seeing the fear in her eyes but also something stronger. A plea for mercy, not for herself, but for all of them, for everyone who had been caught in the crossfire of this lawless world. Don't, she repeated, her voice more steady this time. If you kill them, there will be no end. This won't stop. Her words hung in the air like a heavy truth. Red Hawk knew she was right. Violence bred more violence, but every part of him, every instinct honed through years of tracking and survival, urged him to strike. Yet here, in this moment, the choice was not as simple as a quick kill. The leader seemed to sense a shift. With his bloodied hand still clutching the knife, he motioned for his men to stay back. His voice came low, barely above a whisper. This isn't over, girl. We'll find you again. Red Hawk didn't move. He simply nodded once, his gaze cold and unwavering. Go, Red Hawk said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Leave now. And if I see you again, it will not end well. The leader hesitated, his pride burning, but he knew the game was over. Red Hawk had shown him the power of patience and precision, and in the face of that, the outlaws were nothing more than a scattered, desperate group. The leader turned and motioned for his men to follow. One by one, the outlaws retreated, leaving behind the wreckage of their failed attempt at control. Their footsteps echoed in the gorge as they vanished into the shadows. For a long moment, Red Hawk stood still, watching them disappear. When the last of them had gone, he turned toward Sarah, his expression softening ever so slightly. She stood silently, her hands still bound, her face pale but no longer marked by fear. He could see her strength beneath the surface, the quiet courage she had kept hidden for too long. Red Hawk stepped forward and gently untied the ropes around her wrists. The tension in her shoulders seemed to melt as the ropes fell to the ground. She rubbed her wrists, a small wince crossing her face, but she didn't say anything. No gratitude was needed between them. There was only the understanding that they had survived. For now. Thank you, she said quietly, meeting his eyes. There was sincerity in her words, but more than that, there was trust, a bond formed in the silence of shared hardship. Red Hawk nodded, though his mind remained focused on the path ahead. We're not safe yet. We need to move. Her gaze shifted toward the path the outlaws had taken, then back to him. Where will we go? North, Red Hawk replied. The outlaws will circle back. But if we take the high ground, we can stay ahead. He turned and began to move, his footsteps silent on the rugged terrain. Sarah fell in behind him, her steps more hesitant at first but growing more confident with each stride. As they made their way through the gorge, the landscape began to shift. The narrow passage widened, revealing a valley below, bathed in the fading light of the afternoon sun. Red Hawk's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, his senses alert for any sign of danger. But in that moment, as they moved further into the mountain pass, there was a strange sense of calm. The danger was still there, lurking, but it felt more distant, now less immediate, as if they were stepping into a new phase of this journey. You're not from around here, are you? Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quieter now, reflective. Red Hawk glanced over his shoulder, catching her gaze. No, I've traveled these mountains for years, but not like this. He paused for a moment. It's different, now. I've never been outside of town before. Not for long, she said. It's strange. But I think I'm starting to understand what you mean. Red Hawk didn't answer. He didn't need to. The path ahead would speak for itself. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, they continued their journey together. A strange alliance formed in the face of danger, their fates now intertwined on the rugged road ahead. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the rugged landscape around them in hues of orange and purple. The distant mountain peaks, sharp and jagged, stood like silent sentinels as Sarah and Red Hawk moved steadily through the valley. The cold, evening air bit at their faces, but neither of them spoke of the chill. They had far more pressing concerns than the weather. The outlaws were still out there. Their threat lingered, a shadow that stretched across every step they took, but for now, it was the quiet of the mountains and the sound of their own footsteps that filled the air. Every now and then, Sarah would glance over at Red Hawk, but he remained ever vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon. She had learned quickly that he was a man of few words. Everything about him was precise, deliberate, his movements, his speech, his choices. It was clear he didn't have time for anything that didn't serve his survival or the mission at hand. But Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he ever had moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the world felt too much to bear. It was a thought she would never voice. Not now. Not when everything felt so fragile. They walked in silence for a while longer, the only sound the occasional rustle of dry leaves underfoot or the distant call of an eagle soaring above. But then, as they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a small creek, Red Hawk stopped abruptly. "Wait," he murmured. Sarah froze, her heart rate picking up. She had grown accustomed to his sharp instincts. But the suddenness of his pause still unsettled her. Red Hawk crouched low, his hand motioning for her to do the same. She complied quickly, lowering herself into the sparse brush. The tracker's gaze was fixed on the far side of the ridge, his body coiled and tense like a predator sensing danger. "What is it?" she whispered, but he silenced her with a raised hand. His ears twitched slightly, a subtle gesture that showed he was listening intently to something in the distance. A soft crackle of underbrush echoed from the valley below, distant but unmistakable. Red Hawk's sharp eyes narrowed. Outlaws. Sarah's heart sank. The gang hadn't wasted any time. "How far?" she whispered. "Close," Red Hawk replied in a low voice, scanning the terrain. He rose slightly, adjusting his position on the ridge, and Sarah followed suit. She tried to keep her breathing steady, though her mind raced. The outlaws had left, but now it seemed like they were closing in again, perhaps searching for another way to trap them. Red Hawk's earlier warning echoed in her mind. "We're not safe yet." She glanced at him, his face set with quiet resolve. Despite the danger that loomed just beyond the bend, there was something about him that seemed unaffected, as though he had seen it all before. He moved with the ease of someone who had lived this way for a long time, navigating the wilderness with a level of comfort she could hardly imagine. "We need higher ground," Red Hawk said, already moving again, pulling her along with him. "Stay quiet." They quickly climbed up the rocky slope that led to an overhang, using the natural terrain for cover. The valley below stretched out in the fading light, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest as she crouched low, her eyes scanning the darkening landscape for any sign of movement. Red Hawk held up a hand, signaling her to remain still. In the distance, just visible against the darkening sky, shadows began to move, men on horseback, riding through the valley below. The outlaws were searching, their movements slow and deliberate. They hadn't yet spotted Red Hawk and Sarah, but it was only a matter of time. The sound of hooves grew louder, the heavy rhythm echoing off the stone walls of the gorge. Sarah's pulse quickened, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. She had come to realize that this wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for her own future. The outlaws were after her, yes, but they were also after the sheriff's reputation. They wanted to break him, make him bleed in ways that would scar the entire town. And as much as she wanted to help Red Hawk and keep moving forward, she knew the truth. They were not just fleeing, they were being hunted. "Stay low, Red Hawk," said his voice, a soft command. He pulled his bow from his back, knocking an arrow with the fluid grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Sarah stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the moving figures below. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the fear creeping up her spine, but there was something else beneath it. Something strange and liberating. To Dot, she was no longer just the sheriff's daughter. She wasn't a helpless hostage. In this moment, with Red Hawk by her side, she was part of something bigger, something she had never known in her old life. And for the first time in a long time, she felt as if she had a say in what happened next. Red Hawk's eyes remained fixed on the outlaws as they neared the base of the ridge. He tensed, his muscles coiled like a bowstring. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through, and Sarah felt herself holding her breath, the world narrowing down to the few seconds that lay between life and death. Finally, Red Hawk released his breath, lowering his bow. "We'll move when they pass," he said quietly, his voice as calm as ever. Sarah nodded, trying to still the nerves that ran through her. She watched the outlaws below, every movement of theirs sending ripples of fear through her. But she knew this was the reality they now faced. They weren't just running, they were learning, surviving, and adapting to this unforgiving world. She wasn't alone, and neither was he. The outlaws passed by without noticing them. Their backs turned to the overhang where Red Hawk and Sarah lay hidden. They rode on, their voices muffled by the distance, unaware that the two they sought were still so close, still very much alive. When the last of them was out of sight, Red Hawk stood slowly, signaling Sarah to follow. Without a word, they moved, swiftly and silently, like shadows on the wind, slipping into the night. The night descended quickly, the stars emerging in the sky like pinpricks of light against the deep navy backdrop. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Sarah shivered, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. She followed Red Hawk as he moved with quiet precision, his steps barely making a sound on the rough terrain. The weight of the silence between them felt different, no more peaceful, as if the distance of their pursuers had given them a brief respite. They had managed to slip past the outlaws, but Sarah knew it wouldn't be long before the danger returned. The world felt smaller now, confined to the space between the valley's cliffs and the darkening woods. There was no guarantee that they'd make it through the night without being spotted. But for the first time since her capture, Sarah allowed herself to take a breath, to relax her shoulders. She glanced over at Red Hawk, who was still moving ahead without a word. He was a man of few gestures, but in the way he carried himself, Sarah could tell that he wasn't just a hunter, he was a survivor. Every choice he made was calculated, every movement purposeful. She couldn't help but admire him, despite his stoic nature. There was a strength in him that she recognized, a quiet determination that she had come to trust. They reached a small clearing nestled in the foothills, where a trickling stream wound its way through the rocks. The sound of water was calming, and Sarah sank down onto a moss-covered boulder beside the stream, grateful for the pause. She rubbed her hands together to generate some warmth, but the chill in her bones refused to subside. Red Hawk surveyed the area quickly, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. After a moment, he nodded to himself, then began to collect firewood. His movements were fluid, efficient. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always with purpose. "Can you start the fire?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. Sarah nodded. She had learned a bit about starting a fire when she was younger, though she'd never had to do it under such circumstances. She'd always relied on others, her father most of all, for things like this. But now, in the quiet of the night, it felt different. She was no longer just someone waiting to be saved. She was becoming someone who could survive on her own terms. The sky above was awash of deep blues and purples, stars blinking down from their eternal watch. The fire crackled to life with Sarah's careful work, and soon, the warmth began to spread, reaching into her bones. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease, even if only for a moment. When Red Hawk finished his task, he sat down on the opposite side of the fire, keeping his distance but still close enough that Sarah could hear him if he spoke. "I'll be taking first watch," he said quietly. "You rest." The offer was more of a command than a suggestion, but there was no malice in it. Sarah understood. She hadn't realized how tired she was until now. Until the quiet settled around them, and the weight of everything they had endured came rushing back. But she didn't want to sleep, not yet. She had too many questions, too many thoughts spinning in her mind. Red Hawk looked at her, his gaze steady. "You're safe here. For now, safe." The word felt foreign in her mouth. She had been taken. She had been helpless. But now, she was here, in the mountains with a man who barely spoke and had no real reason to help her. And yet, she knew he was trying to protect her just as she had tried to protect herself. And him. She nodded but didn't reply, her thoughts turning inward. Her father, the sheriff, would be frantic by now. He would never stop looking for her, never rest until she was home. The image of him, strong and determined, flashed in her mind, her protector. The man who had raised her to be strong, to stand up for what was right. But that world felt far away now. She wasn't in that town anymore, surrounded by familiar faces. The rules were different here, in this wild place where survival was more important than right or wrong. "I didn't get your name," Sarah said after a long pause, breaking the silence. Her voice felt small in the vastness of the night. "What should I call you?" Red Hawk didn't answer right away. He sat still, his eyes fixed on the fire, as if the question hadn't registered. But then, after a long beat, he spoke. Red Hawk. She waited for more, for an explanation or a reason, but it didn't come. His name hung in the air, simple and direct. There was no need for elaboration, no backstory. Red Hawk was who he was, and the name fit him perfectly. It was both powerful and mysterious, like the man himself. Red Hawk, Sarah repeated, letting the name settle in her mouth. It felt right. It fit the man sitting across from her, the one who had saved her and who, for reasons she couldn't fully understand, was now guiding her through the wilderness. Red Hawk didn't acknowledge her repetition, but the slight tension in his shoulders seemed to loosen, just a fraction. Perhaps it was the quiet of the night that allowed for moments of stillness, of unspoken understanding. Or maybe it was the firelight, flickering between them like a bridge of warmth. Sarah sat in silence for a while, letting the fire's heat seep into her skin, trying to push the thoughts of the outlaws and the dangers that awaited them from her mind. But it wasn't easy. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig, sent a sharp jolt through her body. She knew the danger wasn't over, it would never be over as long as the outlaws were after her. But for the first time in days, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of escaping it all, of starting fresh, far away from the life she had known. Red Hawk's voice broke through her thoughts. Get some sleep, he said again, his tone as calm as ever. I'll wake you in a few hours. She hesitated, then nodded. Thanks. She lay back against a patch of soft moss, pulling her cloak tighter, trying to block out the chill. The night felt like a breath held in the darkness, suspended in time. She could hear Red Hawk's steady breathing, the crackling of the fire, the distant calls of animals in the night. And then, slowly, she allowed herself to drift off to sleep, knowing that when she awoke, the journey would continue. There was no turning back now. The dawn broke quietly over the mountains, the first rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the valley. Sarah awoke to the sound of a distant bird call and the warmth of the fire still crackling softly beside her. She blinked, disoriented. For a moment, the events of the previous days rushing back to her in a flood. Red Hawk was already awake. Sitting cross-legged by the fire, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. His presence was a constant, solid and unyielding, like the mountains themselves. Despite the danger, despite the exhaustion, he seemed to be at peace, focused, alert, and ever watchful. Sarah sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The stiffness in her body reminded her of the long night they had spent traveling, and the brutal journey still ahead. She looked at Red Hawk, who seemed to have barely moved since she last saw him. His face was unreadable, but she could see the fatigue behind his dark eyes. We should move soon, Red Hawk said, his voice low but steady. The outlaws will be back before too long. We need to stay ahead of them. Sarah nodded, pushing herself to her feet. Her body ached, but there was something in the quiet of the morning that stirred a sense of resolve in her. This wasn't the world she knew, but it was the world she had to survive in now. She had come to terms with the fact that her life as the sheriff's daughter was over. That world had been safe, predictable, and structured, but it had also been a prison of its own kind, one built on rules and expectations that had never truly allowed her to grow. In the mountains, there were no rules, only survival. I'm ready, she said, wiping the dirt from her hands and standing tall. The words felt more solid now, more certain. She wasn't a prisoner. Not anymore. Red Hawk gave her a short nod of approval, then rose to his feet with the fluid motion of someone used to long days on the move. He packed up their camp quickly, each movement efficient and purposeful. Sarah watched him for a moment before turning her attention to the fire. It was nearly out, the embers glowing faintly. She took a moment to reflect, her eyes lingering on the dying flames. Thank you, she said again, her voice quieter this time. For everything. Red Hawk didn't turn to face her as he continued to gather their things, but she saw a brief flash in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't surprise, but something akin to understanding. He simply nodded once, the briefest of acknowledgments, and motioned for her to follow. They began to move through the dense underbrush, heading toward the higher ground. The world around them was still, the morning air crisp and fresh. The sun was rising higher, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the outlaws realized they were no longer in the valley. Their pursuit would be relentless, but so would their flight. The trek through the mountains was challenging. The the terrain growing steeper and more rugged with each step. They climbed higher, away from the path the outlaws had taken, and into the heart of the wilderness. As they made their way through the thick trees and uneven rock formations, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what would become of her and of Red Hawk once they escaped. There was no town to return to, no home to seek refuge in. The life she had known was slipping further away with every mile they traveled. Hours passed, the sun rising higher, until they reached a narrow pass between two steep cliffs. Red Hawk paused at the entrance, his senses alert. His eyes flicked over to Sarah, a silent question in his gaze. She gave him a small nod, signaling that she was ready to continue. They moved through the pass cautiously, knowing that they were closing in on the boundary of the land they knew so well. The air was heavier now, charged with the sense of a final confrontation. The outlaws would catch up to them soon. The only question was whether they would be ready for what came next. As they emerged from the narrow pass, Sarah felt the world shift around her. They had entered a new territory untouched by human hands, wild and untamed. It was a place where only the strongest survived, where even the mightiest of men could be humbled by the land. And yet, for all its harshness, there was a strange beauty to it, an untapped freedom she had never known before. They stopped briefly at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. The valley below stretched for miles, a sea of green and brown dotted with rocks and rivers. The mountains stood like ancient guardians, their peaks shrouded in mist. "We're close," Red Hawk said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was a note of finality in it. "They'll be here soon." Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. She had heard the fear in his voice, something she hadn't expected from him. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was the final stand. "I know," she replied, trying to steady her own nerves. "What do we do?" Red Hawk's eyes narrowed, his jaw set. He looked out at the valley below, the shadows of the mountains stretching long in the late afternoon light. "We fight," he said simply. "We make our stand here." And that was all the preparation they needed. Red Hawk had lived through countless battles, but now it was his survival, and hers, that depended on this moment. They had reached the point of no return. This was the place where the outlaws would catch up to them, and it was here that they would either escape or die trying.